Well, hello everybody. Happy Sabbath to all of you. Glad you've tuned in to worship with us this Sabbath. I'm excited to share the message that I have for you today. It's actually going to be a series, and I'm going to cover a couple of sermons. Ridge will cover a sermon. I also have a guest speaker for you that I think you'll like what he has to say as well. So we plan on doing a four-part series, and this is going to be a series where we are, where we're looking into the life of Joseph. Joseph is a fascinating figure in the Bible, and his story, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting stories in all of the Bible. There's a lot of drama, and there's just some really interesting things that happen to him. But more importantly than that, there are just a lot of really good life lessons about God and just about life, and I think there's some great things to study there in the life of Joseph. So it's a lot of stuff in Joseph's life, actually. He's one of the guys, one of the top guys, you could say, in the Old Testament where there is the most biographical information about him. He's up there with people like David or Moses, where you really kind of get their life story unfolding in a lot of chapters. So there's a lot of their story that's in the Bible. It's not just maybe like a paragraph or two or one chapter, but there's multiple chapters on some of these Old Testament figures, and Joseph is one of them. And it's a very fascinating story. So I think what I'll do to, for us to study this today is just kind of tell the story of Joseph's life, and then we'll look in the scriptures and find some very helpful principles there. So Joseph was the 12th son of Jacob. Jacob had 13 sons and one daughter. So I would think that their house was kind of a wild place. If you have 13 sons and one daughter, I bet that was the toughest girl that's probably ever lived, right? 13 brothers. And so he was the 12th, okay? And then the youngest was Benjamin. And Joseph, it says in the Bible that Jacob loved Joseph more than his brothers. So his dad really showed him a lot of favoritism, which of course did not endear Joseph very much to his brothers. His brothers were just jealous of him, did not like him. And Jacob did things like once he made this coat of many colors for his sons. So he made a coat with these different dyed wool. They were shepherds, so they would shear the sheep and they would then make wool and make garments out of that. And dye was very expensive back in those days. It wasn't like today, where if somebody's wearing a red T-shirt, that you could just pay a few bucks at some store for. If you had, say, like some clothing that had colors in it, that was really like a sign of status. It was a sign of wealth. The average person did not have clothing with colors in it. It was just drabby kind of wool clothing. So if you had something bright, it showed status. It showed wealth. It showed that you were somebody of means and that you were important. So it wasn't just one of these things where I have two kids and one of them gets something and the other says, "Where's mine at?" There's always that dynamic with siblings, but it was more than that. It was really like Jacob conferring on Joseph, who was one of the youngest sons, by the way. In that culture, the oldest son was really the one that was supposed to be the most respected. Well, this is, one of the youngest, the second to youngest son is getting the coat of many colors. It's sort of a status symbol. And so this obviously made the brothers angry. And another thing happened that actually made these guys not too happy with Joseph, and that was Joseph had dreams, and they didn't like the dreams and the interpretations. So Joseph had a dream where there were these stalks in the field, and Joseph's stalk, rose up, stalk like of grain, and then the others that represented his brothers all bowed down to his stalk, and so they didn't like that. And then he had another dream where it was the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they all bowed down to him. And even his dad said, "You think we're all going to bow down to you?" So Joseph was obviously pretty naive and immature, I guess you could say. I mean, I don't know if he was immature for like a teenager, because he would have been a teenager at this time, maybe 15, 16 years old. And so, your people skills aren't always off the charts when you're that age, and you don't always have enough sense to say, keep your mouth shut. And Joseph really probably should have kept his mouth shut. If you're having dreams that everybody bows down to you and these people already don't like you, you may not want to go and just tell them those dreams. But Joseph is, doing that. And so this resentment is building there in his brothers, and it really comes to a headway later in the story. So his brothers are off, and they're shepherds, so they have large territories that they take their sheep to graze in. And the brothers haven't come back for some time. Now, this will be the brothers minus Benjamin. Benjamin and Joseph stayed at home, the two youngest, and the older brothers, were gone. And so Jacob, their father, says, why don't you go and check on your brothers? And so old naive Joseph, in his coat of many colors, goes trotting off and looking for his brothers, and he eventually finds them long, long way from home. And they hatch a plan, and the plan actually begins with killing Joseph. So they're going to kill him, but they end up throwing him down in a pit, and they're just going to leave him there. Well, then one of the brothers, it's actually Judah, he has a thought, because at this time, while they're sitting down there and eating, and they've just thrown Joseph in the pit, they see a caravan of traders that are coming, like you trade in things, not traitors, like a traitor against your country. Sorry, side note, it was kind of funny, but when my son learned this story, he went to church and was telling everybody that he wanted to be a trader when he grew up. And he meant like a trader, like you're trading, but people thought he was saying, I want to be a trader when I grow up. I have to say, oh no, it's the story of Joseph, and I have to kind of explain what that meant. So these were traders that were coming by. And so Judah says, hey, why should we just leave him here to die and not make any money off this? Why don't we sell him as a slave to these traders that are coming by? And so that's what they did. And they sold Joseph, and Joseph then was sent down to Egypt to be sold into bondage. He was about 17 years old when this goes on. And so life obviously took a real turn for the south, for Joseph there, a turn for the worst. It was not a good situation at all. This had to be very, very traumatic for him. For one, just the terror of that. You're this young person who's going off to live in this place, that you've never been to, and you're going to be a slave. And on top of that, your own brothers conspired against you to do this to you. That had to be unbelievable betrayal and grief and just anger and all of these emotions and despair, had to be there. But we see that Joseph actually, things go well for him there in Egypt. It's interesting in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, which if you haven't read, I encourage you to read. It's a wonderful book. In the book Patriarchs and Prophets, it says there that as Joseph, is going down there and he's just giving into despair, that obviously it's those lessons that he learned as a child about God that were with him in this difficult time. And so it's the same with us, the lessons that we learn, especially in childhood, but obviously in adulthood, however you learn them, that's going to help us get through the tough times in life. And this is what happened for Joseph. So Joseph gets down there to Egypt, and he is sold to a man named Potiphar. And this is a very high-ranking official in Egypt. And Joseph becomes his servant. And God is blessing Joseph, and so Joseph's very good at what he does, and so Potiphar is just thrilled with this guy. He's really running Potiphar's household. Well, everything seems to be going pretty well. I mean, if you're going to be a slave, that's about as good as it can get. Joseph's not out there, working in the hot sun. He's living in a palace, running the affairs of a very wealthy and influential person. So, he's better off than most people in Egypt that aren't even slaves. Joseph, I'm sure he's eating good food and living a good life, and things are going pretty well. Well, that all takes a turn when Potiphar's wife decides that her and Joseph need to get to know each other a little better, if you know what I mean. And Joseph is not going to do that. She actually grabs him and is trying to really pressure him and force him. And Joseph says, I'm not going to do this. Should I do this thing and sin against, my master and sin against God? And so he runs off actually leaves his garment in her hands. He comes out of that garment, he's gone. And then Potiphar's wife, man, very wrong what she does. She goes to Potiphar and says, look at what this guy did, and has his garment and all that. And so Joseph gets thrown into prison. Now, the scriptures say, it's in the book of Proverbs, it says that even a child is known by its reputation. What I find interesting about this story is the fact that Joseph was just simply put into prison for something that really should have gotten him killed. The fact that he was just put in prison, I think, shows pretty clearly that Potiphar did not really believe his wife. He lived with her, and it's, character eventually manifests itself, right? You can fool some people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And you really can't fool your spouse, right? I mean, the people you live with, they know the good, the bad, and the ugly, what you're really like. And so obviously this is not a good person that would do something like this to Joseph. So Potiphar knew she wasn't a good person. And I think he knew that Joseph was a good person. So the fact that he just put him in jail instead of killing him really shows Potiphar didn't buy this story. But, he's got his wife there and all this thing with Joseph, and so he's got to do something. The situation can't continue, so Joseph's got to go, and he ended up being put in prison. Well, we don't know how long he was in prison for. We know it was over 2 years, but we're not sure the exact time that he was in prison. But it would have been, like I said, numbered in the years. And during this time that he's in prison, 2 of Pharaoh's officials get sent to prison as well. One of them is Pharaoh's baker, who bakes the bread and the food and all that. And the other one is Pharaoh's butler, some versions say, or cupbearer. Other versions will say essentially that he would be the one who would bring the wine and the drinks and those kind of things to Pharaoh. Well, they did something to make Pharaoh mad, so they got thrown into prison, and they both had dreams. And I won't take the time to tell you the dreams, but I'll just tell you Joseph interpreted the dreams for them. And he said to the butler or the cupbearer, he said, hey, you're going to be restored to Pharaoh in 3 days. You'll be back in good graces with Pharaoh, and you'll get your old job back. And the baker got excited and said, oh, that's good. What about me? And Joseph didn't have as good of a report for him. He said, he interpreted his dream, told him the specifics of the dream and what each symbol meant and so on. And he says, in 3 days, you're going to be hanged. Oh, that's kind of a downer, right? Well, that's what happened. And so the cupbearer was restored to favor. Joseph said to him on the way out, hey, look, I haven't done anything wrong, okay? So remember me when you're back there with Pharaoh and, do something to help me out here. The guy didn't, though. He didn't remember him for 2 more years, it says. And so then finally, the story keeps going, and Pharaoh has a dream. And he has a dream, strange dream, where these 7 fat cows and there's 7 skinny cows, and the 7 skinny cows eat the fat cows. And Pharaoh doesn't know what this means. And so he's speaking with his officials and trying to figure this out. And the butler then remembers Joseph and says, oh yeah, there's this guy. Remember when you were mad at me? I met this guy in jail. And he told me what was going to happen and even gave me how many days it was going to be because I had a dream. This guy interpreted my dream and everything happened just like he said it would. And the baker also had a dream. Remember, you were mad at him too. And everything happened with the baker just the way this guy says. So you really should talk to him. And Pharaoh obviously thought that was a good idea and said, bring him in. So then Joseph comes into Pharaoh. He interprets the dream for him. And he says there's going to be 7 years of prosperity and lots of good crops and all this, and then 7 years of famine. So we can, use the 7 years to get ready, of the good years to get ready for the bad years. And Pharaoh says, okay, why don't you be in charge of that? And so Joseph is the guy in charge. And so they save up all of this grain. And so when the famine comes, then they got plenty of food to feed people. And of course, Pharaoh is a big hero to everybody, but it's really Joseph who brought this about. So now Joseph is now, in very good graces with Pharaoh. Well, the famine's there in the land, and then Joseph's brothers are up there in Canaan, which isn't all that far away, and the famine is affecting them. And one day, Joseph's father, Jacob, is sitting. He says this to his sons. It's kind of funny. It's such like a fatherly thing to say. He actually says to them, "Why are you guys all sitting around looking at each other? Do something to get some food. Go down to Egypt. I've heard they have some food down there." So he's frustrated with his boys, just sitting around, not finding any solution to the problem. So they go down to Egypt, and guess who they run into in Egypt? Remember, these are the same guys who sold him into slavery. At this point, it probably would have been, I don't know. I didn't do the math, honestly, in the Bible before. But he was in Pharaoh's house and or Potiphar's house and in prison. We can look at the genealogy and line that up. I think that's about 10 years, I want to say. He was, I think it was maybe 13. I don't know. Look it up. You can find it in the Bible. You can even Google this stuff now, okay? And then it was about, there was the years of the fat cows and so on. So this would have been, an easily, 17, 20 years somewhere in there that they've, since this happened. So Joseph's different. He was like a 17-year-old kid at this time. Now he's a grown man, in his late 30s. And he's dressed like an Egyptian. You've seen those paintings and all how they dress. They have the eyeliner on and all this stuff. And also he's dressed in a way that they just don't recognize him. He looks like an Egyptian. He's speaking Egyptian and all this. So they go down there and there's Joseph. But Joseph recognizes them. And he realizes, these are my brothers. And the story really gets wild, all right? So basically he gives them some grain. They go back, but he questions them. And anyway, I won't read all this stuff in the Bible. This is an amazing story, okay? He ends up keeping one of the brothers with him because he says, you guys are spies. Like, no, we're not spies. Are you spies? No, we're not, please, And they actually all bow down to him and all this. And it says, and Joseph remembered his dream. Isn't this amazing? That God knows every day of our lives before that day ever even comes. That's incredible that Joseph had dreamed all of this. And so when his brothers were doing something wicked to him, they were actually fulfilling the whole plan and purpose. That's very profound when you think about it. They bow to him. He remembers his dream. And he's saying, you guys are spies. And he's not even speaking. He's speaking through an interpreter. He's speaking Egyptian. And the interpreter is interpreting for them, but Joseph knows everything they're saying, right? He just doesn't let on. They said, no, we're not spies, please no. And so he keeps one of the brothers. I want to say it was Simeon, I think, that he kept, if I remember right. Pretty sure it's Simeon. And he says to them, because he asked him, how's your dad? He's still alive? Yeah, he's still alive. I just want to know about our dad. Yeah, we have a dad. How about you got any brothers? Yeah, we got another brother, right? So that was Joseph's full brother. All these guys are Joseph's half brothers, but Joseph's full brother was Benjamin. And Joseph's obviously wondering, did these guys do something to Benjamin too? These guys, man, look what they did to me. So they said, no, we got a younger brother who's at home. And Jacob did not let Benjamin go with them. That tells me something too. Jacob always had some suspicions about this, because here's how the brothers got out of the whole scheme when they threw him in the pit. They took his little coat of many colors and they killed one of the lambs, and they put some of the blood on it, and they brought it back and said, look, Dad, he must have gotten killed by a wild animal. There's blood on it and all that. So, but Jacob always kind of wondered, right? Right? Character manifests itself. You kind of know what people are about when you really know them. So Jacob doesn't want to send Benjamin down there with these guys. He doesn't want anything to happen to him. Well, they come back and say, here's what happened. This guy was upset with us. He kept one of the brothers, and he said, don't even come back down here unless you bring your brother Benjamin here too. Well, Jacob says, you're not bringing Benjamin. That's not happening. So the famine goes on. And the famine goes on, and the famine goes on, and they get hungry, and the food they brought from Egypt is done. And Jacob says, look, you guys need to go back down to Egypt. And the brothers say, we're not going back there unless we bring Benjamin, because this guy told us, this Egyptian said, you're spies, I'm keeping your brother and putting him in prison, and you don't come here again unless you bring your younger brother. So they told him, we're not going unless he comes with us. And of course, Jacob's just distraught. And he's like, I already lost Joseph from you guys. he didn't really say from you guys, but he said, I've already lost Joseph, and now I got to go down, and I've lost Simeon, and now we got to take Benjamin too. So, but they're out of food, so they have to do it. So then he goes down there with Benjamin. This story gets so wild. And Joseph feeds all of them at this table, right? And they're all wondering, like, they don't know it's Joseph. And they're all wondering, like, what is going on with this Egyptian? You know, he's like mad at us, keeping our brother. And then we come back with Benjamin. He brings our brother. And then he's feeding us at a table and all this, you know. And he gives them a bunch of grain and all this stuff. And then he sends them on their way. Now check this out. So they're riding back home. Everything's fine. All the brothers are together again. They're going back home. They got Simeon. They got Benjamin. It's all good. Well, the Egyptians come and overtake them, right? They gallop up, I guess, on horses, you know, or camels, whatever they're riding. And it says they overtake them. And they said, one of you guys stole a really nice cup that our master had, meaning Joseph, right? And they're like, no, we didn't do it. It wasn't us. And they're like, yes, you did. And like, no, we didn't do it. And they said, look, we didn't do it. So search our bags. And if you find that cup in one of our bags, then that person will be your slave. And they said, okay, fair enough. We're going to search your bags. And the person we find with the cup is going to be our slave. And they said, no problem, because they didn't think they did it, right? And they start with the oldest, Reuben. And they start searching all the bags, right? Then they get to the youngest, Benjamin. And guess what they find? See, Joseph had it put in there. They find the cup. And it says the guys it says they tear their clothes. You know, oh man, this is terrible, disaster. Because remember what they said to Jacob. I don't know if I told you this. But when they're telling Jacob, we have got to bring Benjamin down there, or this guy is not going to see us, and there's going to be no food, no grain. If we go to Egypt, we're bringing Benjamin. And Jacob's like, you ain't bringing Benjamin because he's going to die. And I've already lost Joseph. And it was Judah who actually, you know, says, look, my life for his, okay? He even says, you know, kill my kids if I don't come back with Joseph, which that's an idiotic thing to say. Like, that's going to make grandpa feel better. Oh, okay. You know, pretty impulsive and rash thing to say. But essentially, Judah's saying, look, my life for his, okay? I'm bringing him back to you, Daddy, but we got to bring Benjamin down. So they get down there, and of course this is a disaster now for these guys because they just think Benjamin is, because they already made the deal. If any one of us has your cup, he's your slave. And they said, okay. And they said, well, found the cup. This one's our slave. And they're like, that's the one we told our dad that we would bring back. And we already did this to Joseph. So these guys' guilt is just huge. So they come back. And Joseph's there speaking Egyptian through the translator. You know, of course, they still don't know it's him, right? And he's like, well, how'd you do this? You know, I did you good. I fed you some good food and you steal my stuff. And it's this big drama, right? This is some of the most dramatic parts of the whole Bible. You need to read this. This is all like in the last, the whole story starts about Genesis 37 and goes for like the next like roughly 13 chapters, okay? You need to read it. It's amazing. Or just keep listening to me because I'm telling you the whole story. I didn't really plan on doing the whole thing, but it's so fascinating. I just can't help myself. It's a great story. So anyway, you know, he says, look, this is Joseph speaking to his brothers. I did you good. You did me wrong. So this guy, Benjamin, is going to be my slave and you guys can go. And so he's testing his brothers. See, that's why Joseph's doing all this. He's wanting to see, have these guys had a change of heart? Are they the same guys who lowered me in a pit and then sold me into slavery? Because if they are, then they'll be like, oh, okay, no problem. Keep Benjamin and they'll leave, right? But then they're all like, no, we can't do that because our father, he's going to die if this happens. And then it's actually Judah who steps up. Remember, Judah's the one who originally said, hey, let's sell him to the traders. So Judah's the one that steps up and he tells the whole story. He said, look, here's what happened. And our father didn't want to send him down here, but we begged him and said, you have to. And I told him, I gave my life as a vow. Remember that culture, that stuff's really important. You give vows and all that. That's serious. It ain't like today, right? I promise you, man. No, it's serious business if you're giving vows of your life for things. And so Judah's saying, I gave a vow that I would take the place of this guy, my brother. And so he says, look, take me, but let him go. Please let him go because Our dad is old and he will die if we show up and don't have Benjamin with us. And then in that moment, this is so dramatic. You just got to read it in Scripture. It's so dramatic. It says Joseph sends everybody out, all the Egyptians. He tells them all, get out. So all of the Egyptians leave, and there's Joseph and his brothers right there. And they still don't know who he is. And then it says, it's so powerful in Scripture, he says to them, I am Joseph. And then he says, is my father okay? And it says that the brothers are speechless. They don't even answer his question, because it says they are just, we would say today, like blown away. I think it says in the Scriptures, they'll translate the Hebrew word differently. Some will say they were terrified, and it's probably they're dismayed. They just didn't know. They just didn't know what to say. I am Joseph, and they're just whoa. And then he says, he goes to Benjamin and hugs Benjamin, and he's crying on Benjamin's neck, and Benjamin's crying, and and he kisses all of his brothers. That's like a greeting, right? That's a greeting in that culture. He kisses them and tells them, guys, don't worry, okay? I'm not going to harm you. Because he's powerful, man. He can do whatever he wants to him. And so he tells them, look, go back home. Go get dad, all your families, bring them back here. I got plenty of food. I'm like the boss of Egypt. We'll get you a good place. You guys can live, have your herds and all that. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Don't worry, I'm not upset. All right, I'm not upset. And then but go and do this and come back. So they go, and he actually sends carts and all this and all these gifts and all this stuff with them, like I forget what it says, like 10 donkeys, full of the goods of Egypt and all this, So they go back loaded, right? They go back with a bunch of donkeys and a bunch of carts and a bunch of stuff, and they tell Jacob what happened, and that Joseph's down there. So he doesn't even believe him at first, but then he sees all the stuff they have, and he says, "Wow!" Then it's amazing. So Jacob, of course, he thought his son had been dead all these years. So they go back down there. They have this great, reunion with each other, and it's a happy ending. All right, it's a happy ending. That's the story of Joseph. So I have a question for you. As you listen to this story, and as we just kind of take this journey together of just going through this narrative of Scripture, what lessons do you get from that story? You can think about it, right? You don't need me to interpret it all. That's an epic, epic story, and this is real. This really happened in this guy's life. He goes from this teenage kid to disaster, to elevation to Potiphar's house, disaster again to prison, then elevation to Pharaoh's right-hand man, reconciliation with his family, his brothers. And God, by the way, this is an important part of the story, God used all of this for his purposes. Because you see, down there in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, where they were, there was plenty of space for them to grow. See, where they were up in Canaan, there was more people. They really couldn't have grown exponentially like they would in the centuries to come. Okay, they would have had conflict with their neighbors and whatnot. So God had them come down to Egypt, and they just multiplied and got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they became a nation in Egypt. The Hebrew nation was birthed in Egypt. So that way when they left, remember, in the times of Moses, when they left, it is a huge number of people that are leaving. All of this was in God's providential plan. So I'm going to tell you what I got out of this, all right? Number one, I get out of this that God is with us in the good times and in the bad times. I'm sure it was easy for Joseph, to maybe question that at times. But this was all a part of God's big picture plan. It was way bigger than anything Joseph could have imagined. It wasn't about his own personal life. This was a plan of God's whole plan of salvation And this kid getting sold down into slavery in Egypt was a part of the big grand scheme of God's plan to redeem humanity. And he didn't even know that. So there's more going on in our lives than we realize. And even in the difficult times of life, God is working out his purposes in our lives. Okay? That's number one. A number two lesson I get out of this is that hardship often paves the way for honor and recognition. Joseph became this wealthy, powerful, influential person, but he had to go through a lot of stuff to get there. And you see this pattern throughout the Bible. People that God is going to use in significant ways almost always have periods in their life, especially early in life, of a lot of difficulty and a lot of hardship. Think about David. His brothers weren't real nice to him. He was the youngest son. He wasn't real esteemed. If you read that story with David, nobody was real impressed with David. When Samuel's bringing the different kids in because he's going to anoint one of Jesse's sons as king, they get through all of them, and they said, well, and Samuel said, no, it's none of these guys. Don't you have another one? And they're like, oh yeah, we got this other little one. He's out in the field somewhere, tending the sheep. And they said, well, bring him in, right? And that's the one that he anoints. But that just tells you right there, nobody thought much of David. He's out there just playing the harp and hanging out with the sheep, right? He's not an esteemed person in the family, but yet he's the one who becomes king. He's chased by Saul. You read the Psalms, he goes through so much. But yet God had such incredible plans for David. Think about Moses, 40 years in the wilderness before before Moses is ready to be used by God. I was going to say before God was ready to use Moses, but it was really 40 years before Moses was ready, for God to use him. Think about Daniel, captive in a strange land, right? God's going to use him. He's got to go through some hardship. You can think about Paul. That's another one. Esther, all these different people that God uses, we see they go through hardship. So remember that if you're following Christ. Now, some of our hardships it's our own creation. Yeah, if we're doing foolish things and we're not living according to God's principles, we will experience hardship. But that's not God leading us providentially. That's us being rebellious and doing foolish things and harming ourselves. Okay? I'm talking about when you're seeking God and following him with all your heart, seeking the Lord, you will experience hardship. And a lot of times people will say, I gave my life to Jesus and I'm going through all this tough stuff. What's the deal? This is the deal. God is molding us. He's molding you in those situations to use you in a greater way than he could have possibly used you before you went through all this stuff. Because suffering molds the character like nothing else will. And that makes us more useful in the Lord's work. It teaches us humility. It teaches us not to rely on ourselves. It teaches us compassion and empathy for others. It just makes us more Christ-like people. And those are the kind of people that the Lord can use. And the last principle I got out of this whole epic story in the Bible of Joseph and his experiences in life was that God's plans are always best. Did you hear that? That's important. God's plans are always what is best. I'm sure there were times when Joseph was led to question that. I can imagine when you're sold into slavery, you may question, is this really a good plan? Is God really in control? Where is he at? What's going on? I imagine when you're in prison and everybody's forgot about you, you're just some Hebrew slave that got thrown in prison. Nobody cares about you. There's no appeals process. There's no activist organization you can call to try to get some help. You're just a slave in a foreign land that nobody knows and nobody cares about. You're rotting away in prison. I'm sure it's easy to start thinking, life ain't working out so well. But Joseph never, ever, we have no record anywhere in Scripture of Joseph ever turning his back on the Lord. And we know he didn't because we see how God kept using him and elevating him. You see, Joseph was faithful in the hard times, but listen to this. This is so important. He was faithful in the hard times. Some of us can be faithful in the hard times. Joseph was also faithful in the good times. You see, oftentimes it's harder to be faithful when you're rich, when you have everything you need. You know, Jesus said it's hard for a rich man to go to the kingdom for this reason. You know, when your life's tough, it's pretty easy to lean on God. Or I should say it's easier to seek and lean on God. What about when life's real good? Joseph was faithful when it was tough, when it was good. God's plans are always best. Whatever's happening in our lives, whether it's a hardship or it's, the good times are rolling, it's all a test to see what's really going on inside of us, okay? And to mold us and to guide us, correct us, lead us, develop our characters so that we're ready to be used by God in an ever-increasing way, and we're also ready to dwell with Him in heaven. You know, Joseph said this to his brothers. It's recorded in Genesis 50 and verse 20. He told them, he said, "What you did, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good to save many lives, as is happening this day." There's times when bad things can happen to us in life, but we have to remember that even though the devil may mean it for evil, which he does, even though people may mean it for evil, God will take these things that are happening to us and He will actually turn it for good and to be a blessing to others around us if we're faithful and we stay with Jesus all the way. Romans 8 verse 28 is a wonderful verse, and I'll look it up for you here real quick. Romans 8:28. It's one of my favorite verses in the scriptures. Romans 8, verse 28, it says this, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose." Wow. Did you catch that? All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. I think that's the big takeaway from the life of Joseph, is that in Christ, all things work together for our good, because we serve an awesome God who loves us and cares for us, who will never leave us or forsake us. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, I just thank you so much for this amazing story. It is just a fascinating story and just very interesting, Lord, to read and study. But there's some wonderful lessons there too, Lord. And Father, I pray for each one of us that's watching this and tuned in. I pray, Father, that wherever they're at in life, if it's the hardship phase, if it's the blessing phase, or some combination of the two, that they would lean upon you, Father, learn of you and trust in you and obey you as Joseph did. He never compromised. May we never compromise either. And may you work in your people's lives as we know you will, that your will would be done in each person's lives. Help us all be faithful and faithfully play our part in the great plan of salvation that you have laid out for this world. We thank you, we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, God bless, and hope you have a great rest of your Sabbath, church family.